Hey everybody, we are up to topic 7.12 of the APUSH curriculum. It's titled World War II, Mobilization. So we're going to take World War II, which is a humongous topic, and we're going to break it into two different pieces. Topic 7.12 is all about kind of how it affects the country economically. We're going to look at civilian groups, how they're affected, and so forth. And then in 7.13, we'll tackle more the military side of things, the actual campaign to defeat the Axis powers in World War II. But let's get into this wartime mobilization thing for World War II. And we're going to look at some big changes that came to America because of this mobilization. So let's get into some of those changes. And the first change we're going to look at is well, it's infamous. I don't know how else to say it. And of course, I'm referring to what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. So the origin of Japanese internment is Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. And what this order did is it basically established the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Now, 2/3 of this population was American-born. They were known as Nisei, so like second, third generation, so forth. They had never been to Japan, probably, and they certainly weren't born there. They were American citizens, in other words, being rounded up based on their ethnicity. Now, the justification for this was, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, there was a genuine sense that America was under siege, and we didn't know if there were spies among us. And so therefore, some people decided that we need to round up Japanese Americans because they might somehow, some way be helping the Japanese Empire, passing along information or whatever, plotting sabotage, that kind of stuff. Another justification was, well, with Pearl Harbor, there's so much anger towards Japanese Americans that we should probably keep them safe by isolating them, which is, again, a very flimsy justification. What is true is that these internees lost a lot of things, right? They're going to lose their freedom. They're going to lose oftentimes lots of money, property, businesses that, can't be maintained any longer, and even, their dignity, being rounded up again and put into a camp based on your ethnicity. That's just not what we do in America, or that's what we were told anyways. We wouldn't do something like that. So that fear of rounding up Japanese Americans, the fear rather of potential sabotage, and thus the need to round up Japanese Americans is the subject of this Dr. Seuss cartoon. Fifth column, if you're not familiar with that term, basically that means like spies and saboteurs who are living amongst the population. And this cartoon is implying that they're all just kind of waiting to take orders from home. Now notice the word home, right? That's implying these people aren't really from here, even though, again, 2/3 of them were born in America. They're trying to imply they're somehow different, and their actual home was Japan. So a lot of times people will point to this as, to say, well, gee, Americans are rounding up people and putting them into concentration camps. It's not exactly the same thing. I mean, this is not mass murder, of course, but it is an undeniable, disturbing fact that here's a country rounding up a minority, putting them on rail cars under armed guard, and then shipping them off to a camp. I mean, that's a really disturbing image, to say the least. You can see some of the locations of these various camps. Many of them were just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, out in the West. And there they were. Now, what's interesting about this also is there were, thousands of young Japanese American men who enlisted into the U.S. Army and other armed forces based on patriotism, and they were from the camps. They're willing to fight for the very country that's basically criminalizing their ethnicity, which is a real testament to their patriotism. Now, I'm sure at some point in your mind, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. How can you arrest people and put them in prison without any type of trial, without any type of charging them with anything? Like, how is this legal? In the court case, there was a court case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court to challenge this executive order, and the Supreme Court actually upheld this Japanese internment. The court case Korematsu versus United States. And the Supreme Court argued basically that in times of war, national security sometimes needs to override people's liberties and freedoms. So we're going to, maybe sometimes we have to put the greater good, and those are some serious air quotes by greater good, ahead of individual needs and rights. Not a great precedent set by the Supreme Court, I think we can argue. All right, now let's get into the actual economic side of things and talk about building this war machine. So during World War II, there was a government organization called the War Production Board, or WPB. So yes, another government organization known by its initials, right? As if we haven't seen enough of those. The NRA, the WPA, the CCC, TVA, all those things from the Great Depression. Now we're looking at another one, the WPA. Or excuse me, the WPB. And the WPB, its job was, just like it says, is to produce all the stuff that we're going to need for the war effort. And the numbers are just staggering. 40 billion bullets produced during the war, 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 76,000 ships, and the number just keeps going on and on and on. That's tremendous output. Now, to achieve those astronomical numbers, though, that meant we were going to overhaul our industrial capability and our economy as a whole, which means a lot of production that was considered non-essential will be either limited or halted altogether during the war. The theory was that civilians will just have to do with less because our boys at the front, they need machine guns and they need tanks and airplanes, and therefore we're just not going to produce a lot of the excess stuff. For example, car production halted in early 1942 and not resumed until the summer of 1945. So there was basically a 3-year stretch where no new civilian automobiles were produced in America, which is really crazy to think about because we were the country associated with mass production of automobiles. Speaking of cars, to make our gasoline resources stretch even further, we put into place a national speed limit. I'll reveal the number in a second. It might shock you. And there was also gasoline rationing. So you just had to learn how to do do more with less during World War II. The speed limit, 35 miles per hour, nationwide speed limit. As these headlines imply, not everyone felt like following these, and I'm sure quite a few people continue to speed because 35 is pretty slow. But again, the theory was this would save gas and save wear and tear on people's cars. And you were encouraged to make sure when you got in that car and headed out to the store or wherever you're going that it was a necessary trip. And you try to combine trips. You try to do what we would call carpooling today. Because as the poster tells us, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Now, there's a real economic problem here, right? We've got Americans back to work. Unemployment basically evaporates during World War II. So people are earning more money than they have in a decade or more. But consumer goods are scarce. So if you have a lot of money pent up for consumers, but not a lot of stuff to buy with that money, the danger, of course, is inflation, right? That inflation could really harm our war effort by making the goods much, much more expensive. So to try to keep that down, the OPA, or Office of Price Administration, was established. And again, its goal is to tamp down on inflation. And the way this is going to happen is through rationing and also having these things called ceiling prices. So in other words, you're going to you cannot charge above a certain limit set by the OPA during the war. Again, an attempt to try to keep down inflation. And here we are looking at some materials here about rationing. Right? Do with less, so they'll have enough, the poster tells us. And you can see this war ration book at the top and the little coupons down here at the bottom. And, this is the opposite, of course, of laissez-faire, right? The government is now basically in charge of the economy during wartime. Now, to get around rationing and make things a little easier on you, you are encouraged to grow your own food, to plant a so-called victory garden. and can all that stuff, and so you'll have extra food and you won't need to use as many of those ration points. All right, now let's talk about the mass mobilization of the American people during the war. And as I said, we're going to talk more about military stuff in the next topic, but I do want to stop for a moment and talk about the size of the U.S. military because this is part of the mobilization. All told, about 16 million men will go into the armed forces during World War II. 16 million. Okay, now remember, this is a country where our population is about 150 million during World War II. So we're talking over 10% of all human life in America. But of course, the group being drafted and enlisted is a much smaller window than that, right? It's only men. It's only from a certain age, 18, 25, 30 or so. And so basically, if you were a young man during this time period, you had an incredibly high chance of either being drafted or you just volunteering. I mean, everybody knew somebody in uniform in World War II. Everybody had a cousin, a brother, a husband, a son, somebody they knew who was in the armed forces. About 250,000 of U.S. women also served in the military during World War II. Not in a combat capacity, but in support capacity, nursing and that sort of thing. Now, with this mass mobilization for men going into the military, that's going to lead to some kind of shifting back at home to fill a lot of those jobs. And we'll talk about the factory jobs in a little bit, but here's a job you might not even think about, and that would be farm labor. With so many men going off to fight in the war, someone's got to kind of fill in and do a lot of the hands-on farm labor, particularly things like harvesting fruits and vegetables in the West, places like California, for example, Southern California. And so a deal was struck with Mexico in 1942 to allow what we might call guest workers today to come into California in large numbers, and they would then work on those farms. They were known as the braceros. This is the bracero program. Now, the influx of Mexican population into Southern California, particularly in Los Angeles, led to some tensions for sure. And this is exemplified in 1943 with something called the Zoot Suit Riots. Now, if you're not familiar with the term Zoot Suit, this guy over here is wearing one. It tends to be kind of like baggy pants, a super long, roomy jacket, big hat and all that. And this was something that was very popular with young Hispanic men. So, like 16, 18, 20, 22, whatever, that kind of age. This was like considered the cool outfit to wear. And they were known as Zoot Suiters. And this eventually culminated in basically an attack on these Zoot Suiters by primarily white sailors and other military and civilians as well in Los Angeles in 1943. Now, their justification for this attack by targeting Zoot Suiters is that with all the Zoot Suit, it's got so much extra material there, it's so baggy and big that it's a waste of resources. We're fighting a war. We need to make sure all the material is used wisely and efficiently rather. And this outfit seems to kind of flaunt that in a way that they just didn't seem to like. There's also the racial component as well, in that some white Southern Californians just didn't like the idea of so many young Hispanic men coming into their neighborhood, they just, competing for jobs and so forth. So again, this is called the Zoot Suit Riot. And you can see the headline here from the LA Times, really kind of taking the side of the servicemen in this riot. Okay, now let's look at women and their contribution to the war effort. So we all know this, that many women left the home and went into work during World War II to replace all those men who were off fighting the war. And in terms of numbers, it's about 6 million or so who left their home and went out there to the factory or the shipyards or wherever they were working. And this is often exemplified by Rosie the Riveter, right? And here's a riveter, in case you're not sure what riveters do. These bolts here that hold the things together, those are called rivets. And so she has a rivet gun, and she puts those in there. That makes her a riveter. Now, there was no actual specific woman who was Rosie the Riveter. She was more kind of collective, almost kind of like an Uncle Sam type figure, and that's more mythical than it is real. And she just symbolizes then women's contribution to the war. Now, not all women worked in factories, though. There were some women who did a little bit more active, I guess we'll say, participation in the war. For example, you can see these women here. You can tell they're obviously pilots. They were ferry pilots. So to free up men for combat flights, women were sometimes used to ferry planes, say from factories to air bases. Again, that way the men who would otherwise be doing that flight could be then fighting the Germans or the Japanese or whomever they're fighting. Yeah. Now, this is a little bit of British history, not American history, but I thought I'd point this out. Just because since we're talking about women in war, this young woman who in uniform, as you can tell, she's pretty famous. Pretty famous. This is a young Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom. So the current British Queen, and by current I mean as of 2021 when I'm making this video, she is still very much alive and still very much the Queen of England. She has been now for over 60 years. And there she is back in World War II in uniform. I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe she worked on as like a mechanic or something on trucks, I believe is what she did. Now, the reality is, though, while 6 million women did contribute to the war effort in terms of industrial work and other labor like that, the majority of women actually didn't do that. Most of them stayed home and continued to do what they did always before, their traditional role as mother and wife. And it turns out about 2/3 of the women who went into industrial labor during the war would then later leave those jobs when the war is over. So for them, it was kind of temporary. Now, speaking of women and their traditional role as mother, you may have heard of the term a gold star mother. And you can see the gold star here. And you may not even know what that means, or maybe you do, but you don't know the origins of it. And so the tradition was in World War II is that families would hang these flags, maybe in their front window or maybe outside their home or something, and it would show that, they had a family member off in the war. And you would put blue stars for the number of say, sons that you had out fighting in the war. And if one of them died, you would replace the blue star with a gold star. So a gold star mother is a mother who has lost a son or daughter in the modern sense in combat. All right, let's talk a little bit about migration and see what's going on in terms of movement. So with the demand to produce so much more military stuff than ever before, with that demand, that means there's going to be jobs aplenty. And so people are moving to where the jobs were. And there were towns like Detroit and Seattle and LA that became just massive boom towns because particular industries tended to be located in those areas. Seattle is known for aircraft manufacturing, for example. That's where Boeing was located. Detroit for tank and truck and also airplane manufacturing as well. Now, in terms of building like camps to house the soldiers, to train the soldiers here in the United States, the South is where a lot of these camps were built. And the reason, well, it's several reasons, but the most important reason is climate. It's warmer and milder in the South, and so training could take place more or less throughout the year, as opposed to building a military base in North Dakota or something where it's going to be hard to train for a couple months out of every year. Also, the land tended to be cheaper in the South and easier to basically buy up to build these bases. A good example of this, of one of these southern military bases, would be Camp Campbell, which was built outside of Clarksville, Tennessee, right in the border between, literally straddles the border between Kentucky and Tennessee. And like many of these military bases, this was supposed to be just a wartime temporary base. But it became a permanent base after the war, and now we know it as Fort Campbell, and the 101st Airborne Division is stationed there, although in World War II they were not. The 101st Airborne was trained elsewhere during World War II. All right, so here is your map of the United States, and basically the bigger the circle, the more war industries that took place in those areas. So you could see, the big cities got bigger, and even small cities had a growth because they have, they can contribute. And so you have a lot of people moving off the farm and into cities for the first time. Now, let's look at the role of African Americans here, because this is a continuation of something we've been talking about, literally since the Gilded Age, right? Of African Americans leaving the South. During World War I, it became known as the Great Migration. It's something that's going to continue throughout World War II and even beyond World War II. And so you have Black Americans moving, say, from Mississippi to Los Angeles, or from Georgia to Chicago, or something like that, looking for these wartime jobs. Now, the fear among African Americans would be that they would be discriminated against and they would be paid less for doing the same jobs, building the tanks, the airplanes, and so forth. And that doesn't seem very fair and on a lot of fronts. And so to head that off, FDR issued another one of his executive orders, 8802. And this said in defense industries, that are getting federal dollars, there will be no racial discrimination. So you're going to pay everyone the same. You're not going to limit people's hours based on race and that kind of thing. And this isn't just out of FDR's good heart. This is also the reality that if he didn't do something like this, there probably would have been labor unrest. And there was a lot of that in World War I, right? And we're trying to kind of avoid that again. In particular, A. Philip Randolph, who was in charge of a labor union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, had basically threatened to lead a massive march on Washington, D.C., and to demand that factories hire and pay equally Black Americans as well as everybody else. And so again, to head that threat off, FDR issues this executive order. Now, in terms of Black commitment to the war, it's interesting from their perspective. They felt like they were fighting two wars. This is what's known as the Double V campaign, right? Two victories we're going to achieve. One is over the brutal dictators of Germany and Japan and Italy, right? That we're going to achieve victory over those people. But we're also going to, through our contribution to this war, hopefully conquer and defeat racism at home as well. Now, turns out though, even though there was very serious talk about desegregating the military during World War II, it did not happen. FDR was very hesitant to do this for fear of losing political support from the South. And so he just didn't push that hard, even though he was being pushed to do so by Eleanor Roosevelt and others. Desegregation of the military will not occur until shortly after World War II. And so even though Black Americans fought and served in World War II, they did so, generally anyways, in segregated military units, rather. And oftentimes were denied the chance to even fight in combat anyways. They were often relegated to things like driving trucks and cooking food and that sort of stuff, service jobs, not combat jobs. A good example of an exemption for that would be the Tuskegee Airmen. We've all heard probably of these men who are from the Tuskegee Institute of Booker T. Washington fame. They trained and served as fighter pilots in Europe and got quite a reputation as great pilots. All right, let's now look a little bit at Native Americans, see what's going on with them in terms of World War II. So basically from the Dawes Act on, the majority of Native Americans in America lived on reservations. And then with World War II and with all those jobs in defense industries and in the military to be had, you're going to see a large number of people leave the reservation really for the first time. And they're going to work in wartime factories. They're also going to be in uniform. And a good example of this would be, you may have heard of these because they're pretty famous, the code talkers that were used out in the Pacific. The Navajo were the most famous of this. And basically what they would do is, because their language was totally unknown to the Japanese, they could relay messages over the air via radio, and the Japanese would have no idea what's going on. So they could maybe call in an artillery barrage, or they could send back intel over the air, and the Japanese would just be clueless as to what's going on. A movie made about them would be Wind Talkers. You may have seen this movie before. It's a decent World War II movie. It's not great, but it's decent. All right, last thing, guys, let's look now at wartime economics, and we're going to think about the cost of World War II. And I am not talking human lives. That is something we'll talk about in the next video. We're thinking more about dollars and cents. And it turns out this war was crazy expensive, okay? Over $330 billion, and that is in 1940s dollars. If you adjust for inflation, it's over $4 trillion we spent on this war. $4 trillion. What's a trillion, by the way? A trillion is a million millions. Okay, let that sink in for a second. Now, how do we pay for this staggering cost for the war? Well, about 2/5 of it comes from increased income taxes. And the highest tax bracket on the highest earners in America during World War II was a whopping 94%. Which means if you were in the elite, very rich tax bracket, if you're getting a lot of income, 94 out of every $100 went right back to Uncle Sam for this war. The other 3/5 came from borrowing, kind of like we saw in World War I, right? You're going to have people selling war bonds and people encouraging to buy those, and that's the answer from whom they're borrowing from the American people. And so our national debt is going to skyrocket because of this war. So here we are encouraging people to go buy their war bonds, basically implying if they don't, then America is going to be attacked by these evil forces around us. And there is the national debt. You can definitely tell it increases, just by leaps and bounds during World War II. All right, guys, I know that was a lot of information in this video, but we have covered now one big chunk of World War II. That's the mobilization part. In our next video, we'll focus more on the war and talk about some famous battles, famous leaders, and all that good stuff. And then finally, we'll finish up the war. And then we'll conclude Period 7 by looking at some post-war changes to the world.